They thought she belonged in the kitchen, until the SEAL team was captured and she struck back. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished preparing dinner for 12 hungry Navy SEALs. The military base kitchen was her domain, and she took pride in every meal she served. But as she watched the elite soldiers joke and laugh while eating her carefully prepared food, she couldn't help but notice the way some of them looked at her. To them, she was just the cook, nothing more than a woman who belonged behind the stove. "Hey, Sarah, this stew is actually pretty good," called out Lieutenant Jackson, one of the younger SEALs. His tone carried the kind of surprise that suggested he hadn't expected much from her. She forced a smile and nodded, but inside, frustration burned like a flame. What they didn't know was that before she became the base cook, Sarah had spent 8 years as a Marine reconnaissance specialist. She had completed the same grueling training that many of these men had undergone, excelled in combat tactics, and earned medals for her service in 3 different combat zones. The decision to transition to kitchen duty hadn't been her choice. After a severe injury during a mission in Afghanistan left her with limited mobility in her left shoulder, the military had quietly shuffled her into what they considered a more suitable role for someone with her limitations. The fact that she was a woman made the transition seem natural to her superiors, despite her protests and proven combat record. As the SEALs finished their meals and headed out for their evening briefing, Sarah began cleaning the dishes. Through the kitchen window, she could see them gathering around their commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez. Their voices carried through the thin walls as they discussed their upcoming mission to rescue hostages from a terrorist compound in a hostile region. Sarah had studied the intelligence reports that sometimes found their way to the kitchen staff. She knew the terrain they would be entering, had analyzed the satellite images, and understood the tactical challenges they would face. Her reconnaissance training made it impossible for her to ignore the strategic details, even though she was no longer officially part of the combat operations. That night, as she lay in her small quarters adjacent to the kitchen, Sarah stared at the ceiling and remembered the woman she used to be. She thought about the missions where her quick thinking had saved lives, the times when her smaller frame had allowed her to navigate spaces that larger soldiers couldn't access, and the respect she had earned from her fellow Marines through skill and determination rather than sympathy. The alarm clock beside her bed showed 3:47 a.m. when she finally fell asleep, unaware that in less than 18 hours, everything would change. The same men who saw her as nothing more than a cook would need her skills more desperately than they could imagine. The terrorist compound they were planning to infiltrate had better intelligence than anyone suspected, and the rescue mission was about to become a trap that would test every ounce of training Sarah had ever received. In her dreams that night, she was back in her combat gear, moving silently through enemy territory with the confidence and precision that had once defined her career. She didn't know that soon. Those dreams would become her reality once again, and the kitchen where she felt trapped would become the command center for a rescue operation that would prove her worth to everyone who had underestimated her. The emergency siren pierced through the morning air at exactly 0630 hours, jolting Sarah awake from her restless sleep. She quickly dressed and rushed to the communications center, where chaos had already erupted. Radio operators frantically tried to establish contact with Alpha Team, the SEAL unit that had departed before dawn for their rescue mission. Last communication was at 0545, reported Sergeant Williams, his face pale with concern. They were approaching the target compound when the signal went dead. No distress call, no status update, nothing. Sarah stood at the back of the room, officially having no business being there, but her experience made it impossible to stay away. She listened as the base commander, Colonel Harrison, attempted to coordinate a response with limited information. The original mission had been classified above her clearance level, but piecing together the fragments of conversation, she began to understand the full scope of the situation. The SEAL team had been sent to extract 3 American journalists who had been captured by a terrorist cell operating in a mountainous region near the Pakistani border. Intelligence had suggested a small, poorly organized group with minimal security. Instead, they had walked into a sophisticated trap orchestrated by a much larger and better equipped enemy force. "We need to organize a secondary extraction team," Colonel Harrison declared, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The closest available unit was 6 hours away, and by then it might be too late. The terrorists were known for their brutality and their tendency to execute prisoners quickly to avoid rescue attempts. As the morning wore on, attempts to establish satellite surveillance of the area proved frustratingly limited. Cloud cover and the remote location made visual confirmation nearly impossible. The base felt paralyzed, with everyone knowing that 12 of their best operators were in mortal danger, but having no clear way to help them. Sarah returned to the kitchen, mechanically going through the motions of preparing lunch while her mind raced through tactical possibilities. She had studied this particular region during her Marine service and knew the terrain intimately. The compound the SEALs had targeted was built into a natural depression between two ridges, making it nearly impossible to approach without being detected. But there was another way in, a route that would require someone with her specific skill set and knowledge. During her reconnaissance training, Sarah had learned about an ancient smuggler's path that wound through a series of caves on the eastern side of the mountain. The path was treacherous and would be nearly impossible for a large team to navigate. But a single person with the right equipment and knowledge could potentially reach the compound undetected. She began making careful calculations in her head, estimating travel time, equipment needs, and tactical approaches. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that she might be the only person on the base with both the knowledge and the skills necessary to attempt a rescue. But convincing anyone to listen to her would be another challenge entirely. To Colonel Harrison and the other officers, she was just the cook who happened to be a former Marine. They had no idea about her specialized training or her intimate knowledge of the region where their men were trapped. As she served lunch to the remaining personnel, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She would find a way to make them listen, even if it meant revealing classified information about her past missions and risking her career in the process. The lives of 12 men hung in the balance, and she refused to let them die simply because others couldn't see beyond her current role. Sarah knocked on Colonel Harrison's office door at exactly 1400 hours, her hands steady despite the racing of her heart. She had spent the past hour gathering intelligence reports, satellite images, and topographical maps that she had quietly accessed using her old security clearance codes that hadn't yet been fully deactivated. "Come in," the colonel called. His voice strained from hours of failed attempts to establish contact with the missing team. When he saw Sarah enter with an armload of classified documents, his expression shifted from surprise to suspicion. "Martinez, what are you doing with those files?" "Sir, I have information that might help locate and extract Alpha Team," Sarah said, placing the materials on his desk with the confidence of someone who had briefed superior officers many times before. "I've analyzed the terrain and enemy positions, and I believe I know why the mission failed and how we can fix it." Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You're a cook, Martinez. You have no business accessing classified intelligence or making tactical assessments. With respect, sir, I was a Marine reconnaissance specialist for 8 years before I was assigned to kitchen duty," Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional. "I've completed 3 tours in this exact region and have extensive knowledge of the terrain and enemy tactics." She opened the topographical map and pointed to a series of elevation markers that showed the compound's position. The intelligence reports indicated minimal security, but they failed to account for the natural choke points that make the primary approach routes easily defendable. Alpha Team would have been visible to enemy spotters from at least 3 different positions before they got within 500 meters of the target. Colonel Harrison studied the map, his skepticism beginning to waver as Sarah continued her analysis. She had marked enemy positions, calculated sight lines, and identified tactical weaknesses with the precision of a seasoned intelligence officer. "The compound is built into this depression here," she continued, tracing the contour lines with her finger. "But there's an alternate approach through these cave systems on the eastern ridge. It's a smuggler's route I discovered during Operation Desert Strike in 2019. The caves connect to a series of tunnels that emerge less than 50 meters from the compound's rear entrance. Even if what you're saying is accurate," Colonel Harrison said slowly, "the backup extraction team won't arrive for another 4 hours. By then it will be too late," Sarah finished. "But one person could potentially reach the compound using the cave route in approximately 2 hours. Someone small enough to navigate the narrow passages, with enough tactical experience to coordinate an extraction from inside enemy territory. The implication hung in the air between them. Colonel Harrison stood and walked to the window, staring out at the helicopter pad where maintenance crews were preparing aircraft that might never be used. "You're suggesting that you, a cook with a damaged shoulder, should attempt a solo rescue mission against an unknown number of enemy combatants. I'm suggesting that I'm the only person on this base with both the knowledge of that specific terrain and the tactical skills necessary to attempt this rescue," Sarah replied. "My shoulder injury affects my ability to carry heavy equipment over long distances, but it doesn't impair my ability to move through confined spaces or operate small arms." She pulled out a detailed timeline she had prepared, showing infiltration routes, communication windows, and extraction possibilities. "I can reach the compound by nightfall, establish contact with Alpha Team, and coordinate their escape using the confusion of a diversionary attack on the main entrance." Colonel Harrison turned back to face her, and for the first time since the crisis began, she saw hope in his eyes. "This is completely against protocol, Martinez. If I authorize this mission and something goes wrong, both our careers are over." "If we don't try this, 12 good men die tonight," Sarah replied simply. "I'd rather explain a broken protocol than explain to their families why we didn't attempt every possible rescue option." The colonel studied her for a long moment, weighing impossible choices. Outside his window, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, marking the passage of precious time they couldn't afford to lose. At 15:30 hours, Sarah found herself in the equipment room, methodically checking gear that she hadn't touched in over 2 years. Colonel Harrison had given his reluctant approval, but only after making her sign documents that would protect the military from liability if the mission failed. She understood the politics involved, but her focus remained entirely on the task ahead. Her equipment loadout was carefully calculated for the unique challenges she would face: a lightweight tactical vest, night vision goggles, a suppressed M4 carbine, and enough ammunition for a prolonged firefight. Most importantly, she packed climbing gear specifically chosen for navigating the narrow cave passages that would serve as her infiltration route. "You sure about this, Martinez?" asked Master Sergeant Thompson, the base's senior weapons instructor, as he helped her adjust the equipment harness. He had worked with Sarah during her transition to kitchen duty and was one of the few people who knew about her combat background. "That compound is going to be crawling with hostiles by now." "I'm sure," Sarah replied, testing the weight distribution of her gear. "Those men went in there thinking they were facing a small, disorganized group. They're probably being held in a central location, waiting for their captors to decide what to do with them. If I can reach them before that decision gets made, we have a chance." She had spent the past hour studying updated intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. Satellite imagery showed increased activity around the compound, with vehicles arriving throughout the day. Radio intercepts suggested that the terrorist cell was part of a larger network, and they were likely planning to use the captured SEALs as bargaining chips in negotiations with the American government. As Sarah made her final preparations, word of the mission had somehow spread throughout the base. She could feel the eyes of other personnel watching her, some with skepticism, others with a mixture of hope and desperation. The cook, who they had barely noticed, was now their only hope for bringing their comrades home alive. At 1600 hours, a helicopter dropped her at a landing zone approximately 8 kilometers from the target compound. The terrain was exactly as she remembered it: rocky, treacherous, and unforgiving to anyone who didn't respect its dangers. Sarah moved quickly but carefully, using natural cover to avoid detection while making her way toward the cave entrance that would serve as her gateway to the enemy stronghold. The cave system was even more challenging than she had anticipated. Years of erosion had changed some of the passages, forcing her to navigate by memory and instinct through spaces that sometimes narrowed to barely shoulder width. Her injured shoulder protested against the awkward positions required to squeeze through certain sections, but she pushed through the pain, knowing that every minute of delay increased the danger to the captured team. As she moved deeper into the mountain, Sarah's radio crackled with static-filled updates from base command. The backup extraction team had been delayed further due to mechanical problems with their transport aircraft. She was now completely on her own, with no possibility of immediate reinforcement if the mission went wrong. 3 hours after entering the cave system, Sarah finally reached the concealed exit she had discovered years earlier during her reconnaissance mission. Through a narrow opening disguised by hanging vegetation, She could see the terrorist compound spread out in the valley below. The intelligence reports had been wrong about almost everything. Instead of a small, poorly defended position, she was looking at a well-organized military installation with professional security measures and at least 30 armed guards visible from her vantage point. Sarah settled into position and began her surveillance, methodically cataloging guard positions, patrol patterns, and structural weaknesses. Somewhere in that compound, 12 American soldiers were counting on her to find a way to bring them home. The woman who had been dismissed as just a cook was about to prove that she belonged anywhere. Courage and skill were needed. As darkness settled over the compound, Sarah moved with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of remaining invisible. Her reconnaissance had revealed that the captured SEALs were being held in a concrete building at the center of the installation, guarded by 4 men and monitored by a series of security cameras that had blind spots she could exploit. The first challenge was neutralizing the exterior guards without raising an alarm. Sarah had identified a patrol pattern that left a 60-second window every 12 minutes when the rear approach to the main building would be unguarded. Using her suppressed weapon and years of combat experience, she systematically eliminated the sentries with precision shots that made no more sound than a whispered breath. Moving through the compound was like navigating a deadly puzzle. Every shadow could conceal an enemy. Every sound could trigger an alarm that would bring dozens of armed terrorists down on her position. But Sarah's training served her well, and she reached the prisoner building without being detected. Through a ground-level window, she could see the interior of the makeshift prison. The 12 SEALs were bound and seated against the far wall, guarded by 2 men with automatic weapons. Most of the prisoners appeared to be injured but alert. Sarah recognized Lieutenant Jackson, the young SEAL who had complimented her cooking just yesterday. His face was bruised and swollen, but his eyes still held the determination that had made him part of an elite fighting unit. Sarah keyed her radio to transmit on the frequency the SEALs would be monitoring, knowing that their captors might also be listening. "Kitchen staff to dining room," she whispered, using code words that would be meaningless to anyone who didn't know her role at the base. Special delivery arriving through the back entrance in 60 seconds. She saw Jackson's head turn slightly, recognition dawning in his eyes as he realized who was speaking. He began to shift position subtly, preparing himself and signaling the others without alerting their guards. The rescue itself required split-second timing and absolute precision. Sarah created a diversion by triggering an explosion she had rigged at the compound's main gate, using improvised charges made from materials in her kit. As alarms began blaring and guards rushed toward the disturbance, she breached the prison building through the rear window. The 2 guards inside turned toward the commotion outside, giving Sarah the opening she needed. Her shots were quick and accurate, dropping both men before they could raise their weapons or call for help. Within seconds, she was cutting the restraints that bound the SEAL team, her hands working quickly despite the trembling caused by adrenaline. "How many hostiles?" asked Captain Rodriguez, the team leader, as Sarah freed him from his bonds. His voice was hoarse from hours of interrogation, but his tactical mind was already working. "At least 25 that I've observed. Probably more responding to the diversion," Sarah replied, handing out weapons she had taken from the eliminated guards. "The compound's main defenses are focused on the primary access routes. If we move fast, we can reach the cave system before they organize a proper search." "The cave system?" Jackson asked, confusion evident in his voice. "Martinez, how do you know about caves in this area?" "Long story," Sarah replied grimly, leading them toward the window she had used to enter. "I'll explain later if we all survive the next 30 minutes. As they began their desperate escape through enemy territory, the same men who had seen Sarah as nothing more than a cook were witnessing her transformation back into the warrior she had always been. Her knowledge of the terrain, her tactical skills, and her courage under fire were saving their lives, proving that true capability cannot be measured by current job assignments or physical limitations. The sound of pursuit was growing louder behind them as the terrorist forces realized their prisoners had escaped. The real test of Sarah's rescue plan was just beginning, and their survival would depend on reaching the cave entrance before their enemies could cut off their escape route. The chase through the mountainous terrain became a deadly game of survival that tested every skill Sarah had learned during her years of combat service. Leading 12 injured and exhausted, Seals through treacherous ground while being pursued by an organized enemy force required tactical decisions that could mean the difference between rescue and disaster. "Contact rear," shouted Sergeant Williams as muzzle flashes lit up the darkness behind them. The terrorists had organized faster than Sarah had anticipated, and their pursuit was closing the distance with every passing minute. The rocky terrain that provided some concealment also slowed their escape, creating a tactical nightmare that required immediate solutions. Sarah made the decision that would define her legacy. Instead of leading the team directly to the cave entrance where they might all be trapped, she positioned the SEALs in a defensive formation among the rocks and prepared to hold off the pursuit while calling for the extraction helicopter that was now finally available. "Martinez, you can't hold them off alone," Captain Rodriguez protested. But Sarah was already moving into position with her rifle, using the high ground to create a killing field that would funnel the attackers into a narrow approach. "I'm not holding them off," Sarah replied over her radio. "I'm buying us time for extraction. Get your men ready for helicopter pickup in the clearing 200 meters north of our position." What followed was a masterpiece of defensive tactics that demonstrated why Sarah had been selected for reconnaissance training in the first place. Using the terrain to her advantage, she created the illusion of a much larger defensive force by moving between positions and maintaining accurate fire that kept the enemy pinned down and confused about the size of the opposition they faced. Her radio crackled with the voice of the extraction pilot. "Hawk 17 approaching landing zone. Pop smoke for identification." Sarah threw a smoke grenade into the clearing where the helicopter would land, creating the visual marker the pilot needed while continuing to engage the pursuing forces. Her ammunition was running low, but she had achieved her objective. The 12 men she had rescued were moving towards safety, while she provided the cover that made their escape possible. The sound of the helicopter's rotors grew louder as the aircraft settled into the landing zone. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece. "Martinez, we're loading now. Move to extraction point immediately." But Sarah could see what the others couldn't from their position. A second group of terrorists was moving to flank the helicopter, positioning themselves to shoot down the aircraft as it attempted to take off. She had one magazine of ammunition left and a decision that would determine whether everyone made it home alive. Instead of retreating to the helicopter, Sarah moved toward the flanking force, using the last of her ammunition and her tactical knowledge to neutralize the threat to the extraction aircraft. Her final radio transmission was calm and professional. "Hawk 17, you are clear for takeoff. All packages secure." The helicopter lifted off with its precious cargo as Sarah held her position, using her empty rifle as a club when the remaining terrorists finally reached her location. When the backup extraction team arrived an hour later, they found her surrounded by the evidence of her final stand, wounded but alive, having proven beyond any doubt that heroism cannot be measured by job titles or preconceptions. 3 months later, Sarah Martinez stood at attention in full-dress uniform as she received the Medal of Honor from the President of the United States. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty." But to Sarah, the real reward came from the 12 men who stood in the audience, alive because someone had seen beyond their assumptions about where she belonged and recognized her for what she truly was. A warrior who would never abandon her brothers in arms, regardless of what others thought about her place in their world.